leaders here who are from Lebanon. When it comes to their experience, they are two really passionate leaders, and they do imply every time and do involve in the diplomatic and also social aspects of and challenges of everyday life. So first of all, thank you for being here. And as me and Savannah are going to be the moderators, I'm happy to introduce Stephany Semaan, which is a political science and international affairs student in the Lebanese American University, whose interests are in international engagement and politic dynamics. With an experience across diverse international contexts, she engages with the concept of resilience through both global and local lens. In the context of Lebanon recent developments, she explores resilience as both social and political phenomenon, shaped by uncertainty, institutional challenge, and the adaptive capacity of communities. And at the same time, I'm happy to introduce Hasan Jaber, who is a psychology graduate and dual master's candidate in public health at the American University of Beirut, and clinical psychology at the Lebanese University, whose work focuses on mental health, crisis systems, and young leadership, with experience in emergency health coordination at Lebanon Public Health Emergency Operations Center and over 2 years with the Lebanese Red Cross Youth Sector. He engages with resilience through both practical and research-driven lenses. In the context of Lebanon ongoing crisis, he's going to present us the resilience at a system level and community-based process shaped by emergency response, innovation, and adaptive capacities of individual and institutions. So after introducing you guys, I think it's really important for us to understand your perspectives. And to begin with, I want you to tell me everything you believe it's relevant about the context, historical points we have to take into consideration, and I will ask Stephany to share the presentation with us and to give us an intro, and afterwards we're going to navigate a bit through the questions we prepared.
Yeah. So good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today. So as Patricia said, I prepared a short presentation, a couple of slides, just to provide you with some context on how we got to the point we are at today. And so when we discuss and we mention some points, you're able to contextualize what's happening, why it's happening, and how, like, why it affects us this much. So I'm just going to try to... Okay. Let me know when you can see my screen.
We can see it.
Yeah. So,
Yep,
like I said, before we delve into the current situation, we're just going to take a quick outlook on politics and history of Lebanon. So, as most of you might know, Lebanon is a country in the Middle East, on the Eastern Mediterranean. We're known for cultural diversity, rich history, and we're recognized for our vibrant society, religious diversity, and historical importance. So specifically on the religious diversity point, I think it's one of our strongest points, but it is also one of the weakest points within Lebanon because it has caused a lot of issues over the decades. Like I've mentioned earlier, Lebanon currently is facing a lot of major issues, and understanding those requires having a quick rundown of Lebanon's historical background. So the best place to start is the French Mandate. So before, there wasn't anything called Lebanon. The area geographically was under the Ottoman Empire, which ruled for over 400 years. And then the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, and the French and the English made Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is a very known agreement where they agreed on dividing the Middle East according to their interests. And after that, the mandate system was established within the UN. And what that system did was basically provide the geographic area of Lebanon, or place it under French supervision to help us to eventually gain our independence. However, that didn't exactly happen. It did take the form of colonial rule. And then in 1920, France, to kind of faced with internal pressure from groups that wanted Lebanese independence, they established something called the Greater Lebanon. So originally, people who wanted to have or had the Lebanese identity, it was only Mount Lebanon, which is a mountain in Lebanon. However, when they established Greater Lebanon, they combined extra areas. And those extra areas had different religious groups, different like social groups. So they didn't really want to be part of that. And people in Mount Lebanon didn't want those people joining. So this was the root for a lot of issues that we face up until this day. The country itself, the borders weren't agreed on internally. It was something externally imposed, which is a huge problem. And later on, after like in 1943, we did gain our independence. However, that in like the era between Greater Lebanon and like gaining independence, it was also marked by a lot of French control, and the French were kind of shaping the structure of the government. So our governmental structure in a lot of areas in the public fields are very much shaped by the French system. Now, after that, after gaining independence, the different sects in the country, so Lebanon is very religiously diverse, as I've mentioned earlier. We have 18 different government-recognized sects. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're a Christian, that is your religion. However, your sect could be, you could be a Maronite Christian, you could be an Orthodox Christian like me, or you could be that we have Armenian Orthodox or so on. So same with Muslims, there's also Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims. There's also the Druze religion, which is not Christian or Muslim, it's a different thing. So this diversity, it made people when the independence was occurring, or when the current Lebanon was being established, these people came together and agreed in consensus on dividing the power according to sect. So each sect gets a certain portion or a certain like part of the government. So as we see on the slide, the president is always a Maronite Christian, the prime minister is always a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the parliament is always a Shia Muslim. So at first it did establish a lot of balance because all groups were satisfied, almost all groups were satisfied with this power division within the government. However, eventually that same system that was aimed to maintain the power balance actually ended up disrupting it because there was just a lot of breaches, and it just didn't go well, and it ended up reinforcing imbalance. It caused a lot of patronage networks. It caused the government to be paralyzed in a lot of instances, and it built a lot of where it is the root of many issues we also face today. The formation of Israel also is a huge turning point, not only for Lebanon, but the entire region. We're talking about a new country being formed. It's a foreign concept to all the countries, a lot of tensions, and it obviously had significant effects on Lebanon because it borders Lebanon. So I'm sorry for my parrot in the back. He makes a little bit of noise, but so it increased a lot of like tensions, and Palestinian refugees came in after the conflict going on in the area. A lot of Palestinians moved into Lebanon and they started residing here. So we already discussed how Lebanon is extremely diverse socially. So having an extra layer to that social diversity ended up reinforcing more and more problems, a lot more tension, especially along the Lebanese-Israeli border. And then we move to the Lebanese Civil War. So the social divisions, the religious division that was already in place earlier, all of that exploded during the Civil War. So the Palestinian armed groups that I was talking about earlier, they had like autonomy within Lebanon. So they were able to operate within their camps. They're able to operate without reverting back to the government. And that caused a lot of controversy within the country, caused a lot of issues, and eventually this controversy exploded into civil war. It's very messy. Everyone was massacring everyone, Christians massacring Muslims, Muslims massacring Christians, and there was a lot of shifting alliances. And then we also had many actors enter. So even the Assad regime back then, it also entered the conflict. The Israelis also intervened. Palestinian armed groups were also part of it. It was very, very bloody and extremely messy. And in 1989, we had an agreement called the Ta'if Agreement, which called for the disarmament of all militias except for one, which is Hezbollah. I don't know if you have heard of it. It's the armed group that fights against Israel in the south. And the reason why it was unable to keep its weapons was to keep the Israeli aggression out of the south at the time. However, over time, this possession of weapons, and when I say weapons, I mean weapons, like not rifles. We're speaking missiles, explosives, so on. Their ability to keep these weapons gave them a power advantage within the country and enabled them to advance their interests in many fields. And this also caused a lot of controversy and it's caused a lot of issues. And even after the Civil War, it ended in 1990, the tensions never really went away. It was resolved with the agreement and the fighting stopped. However, tensions still simmered and still are felt to this day. We also face a lot of threats of like going back into the Civil War. If this happens, Lebanon's going to be plunged into civil war again, and so on. Now, after the Civil War, there was a period of reconstruction. Lebanon was still standing on its feet. However, again, a lot of issues occurred. So we did have a 2006 war, which is 1 month war with Israel. But after that, Lebanon also recovered again. And then recently, after COVID, we had an economic collapse. The currency lost its value completely. Like liras is our currency. So $1 was worth 1.5K liras. Now $1 is worth 89,000 liras. So the currency is not really used anymore. Most people use US dollars. Most banks, I'm not going to go into the economic crisis, but basically bank accounts were not, like banks were not trusted anymore. So basically, most people now carry cash, and cash as in US dollars most times. Also, political instability because of corruption and division and all of that. There's just a lot of issues that are day-to-day issues that are caused by these divisions. And these issues are what led to the mass protests in 2019. We had a revolution. At the time I was in school, I think I didn't go to school for like a month and a half because all the roads were closed. People were burning wheels on the road. There was mass protests. It did remain peaceful. It didn't erupt into something violent, so there wasn't fighting. However, it wasn't a period of stability. That's what we could say. And finally, the notorious 2020 explosion in Beirut. So ammonium nitrate, which is a substance used in making weapons, was stored in the Beirut port. Now, the reports and decisions kind of point at the fact that Hezbollah was storing this chemical in the port, and the government at the time enabled it to do that because it was on good terms with it. They were storing it to synthesize weapons to use in combat. And when someone was doing maintenance, he was using a hot tool, and then the substance got heated up and it exploded. This was the largest non-nuclear explosion in human history. It was devastating. Up until this day, you could walk in Beirut and see areas that are still not reconstructed. And up until the current situation, we saw the Gaza war started, the genocide unfolded, and then you see in Hezbollah in the south responded. So for a while there were some border exchanges, and then after that, the pager attack happened. I don't know if most of you are familiar with this also. So Israel had been planning for this since 2015. What happened was pagers that were used in communications between Hezbollah members, before being shipped into Lebanon for them to use, Israel was able to conduct an operation where explosives were planted within those. And at the time, it was rumored to be either done in Hungary or Romania, and then it ended up being in Hungary. And the pagers were shipped in, and basically they exploded, 3,000 casualties, a lot of amputees, a lot of people lost their eyesight. It was very tragic, and that's when the full-on 2024 war erupted. Hezbollah responded very violently, and then Israel back, and so on. And then in November 2024, we had a ceasefire. It wasn't really enforced. There was still aggression going on. And Then recently with the breakout of the Israel-Iran war, also fighting resumed. So Hezbollah like responded in on the side of Iran, and then Israel responded back and bombings and so on. And overall, just speaking of the recent conflicts, we have 1.2 million people that have been displaced, a lot of destruction. We have over 40 towns in the south of Lebanon that have been completely decimated. No houses, no nothing remaining. It's pure decimation. It's completely devastated. And then also economic disruption. Obviously, war harms the economy. Interruptions to education and daily life, which me and Hasan will go over a lot later on. And finally, obviously, very psychologically distressing. I think Hasan could also talk about this a lot more, especially because it's more within his field. And yeah, just like I'm gonna go over everything really quickly just to connect it very well. So French Mandate era, not a very strong foundation, French imposed borders, and then we have the sectarian power sharing system, division between different groups. At first, it was supposed to preserve balance, but then it actually ended up breaking that balance even more. Israel also added more instability with migration and like refugees coming in, caused a lot of problems. And then the civil war, explosion of all these tensions, and after it, that wasn't really resolved. And then many crises going on. So you can definitely say Lebanese people are extremely resilient, and like all of these situations affect us a lot. This is all I have. I don't know if Hasan wants to add anything. I thought I'd leave our contact
Thank you,
info here.
Stephany.
Yeah. If you want to add anything, let me know if you want me to go back to any of the
I think
slides.
that you were like very, very, very inclusive of all major details. Of course, we could add like much more details, but it's going to take a lot of time. So I think that what you went over is more than enough and more than perfect. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you so much for sharing that presentation and going through all of that and adding in that context. I think that was a really good way to kind of feed into the discussion that Patricia and I have prepared. So we have come up with a couple of questions between the two of us that we're just going to bounce back and forth kind of leading into this. And I think Patricia's going to start us off with our first topic.
Yes, so thank you very much again. Stephany, you can leave the presentation on as the title just so we can have it. And as a first question, I wanted to ask you guys, how have the recent airstrikes in Beirut affected your day-to-day life as a student?
Yeah. Hasan, if you'd like to start.
Okay. So, how has the recent airstrikes in Beirut affected my daily life as a student, right? Okay. So honestly, I would say that one of the hardest parts was the strange duality that we were living every day as students in Lebanon, and I think Stephany would agree on that. On one side, like life was expected to continue very normally. Universities continued online, so we still had lectures, we still had assignments, we still had exams and other responsibilities. And on the other side, there was still like fear around us, and very like I want to emphasize on the uncertainty that we were living, that everything could change like within seconds. I would like to share a memory that I have. I remember being at university one day when my mother called me crying, telling me an airstrike, unfortunately, had happened very close to where she was and next to where her car, like next to where her car was parked. In that moment, if I could tell you, my mind was completely out of the classroom. I had no longer thought about grades or deadlines, and I was just thinking if my family is safe, if she was safe. So it was like a surreal feeling, you know? And later the same day, I had an assignment to submit. My professor, of course, was understanding, which I very much appreciate. But I think that this moment explains how, like, the reality that many Lebanese students were living of duality. So we were trying to continue our education while still emotionally carrying the weight of war and uncertainty, like, at the very same time. So that's what I have to say. If Stephany would like to add to what I said.
Yeah, I think it's very similar. For me, I live in a further area than the airstrikes, but my university has two branches. So there's a branch where I live and there's a branch in Beirut. And I have a lot of friends there, so it's it very much would be like I'm texting my friend and then they're not being able to attend classes because they're displaced or they're not sure where they can be, where they are, or where they're going to be, if they're going to have access to the internet. For me, university closed for 2 weeks. And then we resumed with hybrid learning, which wasn't very effective. Most people weren't attending. It was until very recently until we actually went back to physical learning, but that was towards the end of the semester. Um, you can't really learn anything when there's barely any classroom environment. Even online, there wasn't people joining, so you didn't have this classroom essence. Also, like you're constantly thinking about airstrikes. Like for me, obviously being a political science student, my phone is always dinging with notifications, airstrike here, airstrike there. So you're always checking the news, even during class. Like I'm always on my phone checking what's happening here, what's happening there. So you're not really in the headspace to actually be absorbing information. And this is an often overlooked perspective of war and conflict in general. Even if you're not personally being bombed, you're still psychologically tormented by what's going on.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was a really interesting perspective. Obviously, there's a lot of historical context going into these conflicts, but given recent events, when would you say you first started feeling the effects of the conflict, and how has that been exacerbated in the recent Israel-Iranian conflicts?
Yeah.
I honestly think that the effects like were always there in some way for my generation in Lebanon and even older generations. And Stephanie's presentation emphasizes this point. So like we grew up with instability being part of normal life, you know. But recently, of course, especially with the Israeli-Iranian escalation, everything started to feel like much closer and much more intense. For example, like it started to go into our daily conversations and daily decisions. People like were constantly checking the news, worrying about loved ones, thinking about safety, and we was like still wondering if things are gonna get even worse. So I think that what affected me personally most was how mentally exhausting it became, as Stephany already mentioned. Like you try to continue your life very normally, but there's always this tension in the background. So like even when nothing is happening at the exact moment, but people like stay anxious because they know how quickly things can change in Lebanon, literally at any minute.
Yeah, I feel like for me, the beginning of the tensions in like everything that started in Gaza, that was the first point for me when actually things started feeling real. Like for me, my generation, I'd always heard about conflict from my parents. So hearing about the 2006 war or earlier wars, it was always something that it's like a parent's thing, like they would tell you about it. But in 2024, seeing like aggression live on my phone, I have friends in Gaza, so it was like, this is actually happening to people that I know. That made everything feel very real for me. And then obviously with the escalation in Lebanon, that was like exacerbated exponentially. And then more recently, also with the Iran-Israel war, it was just like, oh, that's happening again. Like, I don't think I can add anything more than that. It's just very exhausting overall. Like Hasan said, is there always this noise in the background? You're trying to continue your life normally, but there's always something, it's affecting you in some way, if not directly, indirectly. So, yeah.
I think the details are really relevant for us to understand. And I think what happens to people that do find themselves in those kind of situations is something that you never know what to believe or not. So, for example, when you see different news in the media that maybe some of them reflect the reality of, some of them do put you in a position of doubt or like seem to have certain coverage. How do you see the reality around you in those moments? Like what affects you the most, or how are you dealing with not knowing exactly if something is going to happen in the area you're at or not? How does this place in your reality?
I
Would you like
feel,
to go, Stephany?
yeah, I'd like to add like something very brief. I think in areas where like tensions are very high, especially like for me, I felt way more paralyzed when the war was at its peak than right now. But you're constantly in this state of always wondering like, what happens? Like for me, I'm always concerned about my career. Like I'm like, I want to do this, I want to do that. However, what if something happens and I can't? Like last month, I was supposed to attend a conference that was going to be very huge for my career. And then I couldn't go because there was like flights were stopped, aggression was going on. It wasn't safe to fly. So when things like this happen, you're constantly in hesitation. You're not able to really take a step forward. Sometimes you are like right now, I feel way better compared to the peak of the war. However, it doesn't really end because you're always in this hesitation. You're always at a risk of conflict happening, or like a place you go to maybe to work, for instance, could be endangered at some point. So you're very paralyzed overall. But the paralysis gets better according to the period you're in. But you're overall continuously paralyzed.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to what Stephany has just said, because I think that international coverage often shows the political side of the conflict, but not the reality of how dangerous and psychologically intense, for example, daily life becomes for people here. So when you said about the part, when you talked about the part of how going to work might sometimes feel dangerous, it made me remember one day while I was working at the Public Health Emergency Operations Center at the ministry, and an evacuation alert was issued by the IDF for the entire area where the ministry is located, including two major central hospitals nearby. So in that moment, you stop thinking, of course, in abstract political terms. Like you start thinking about the chronic patients inside those hospitals, the families waiting there, the medical staff, and people like me who were trying to continue the work until at least the end of the day with this level of fear and uncertainty. So I still remember the atmosphere that day and how the tension was like very real. And honestly, regarding the news and media coverage, I don't remember that it was like really covered or reflected in most international coverage. So people often see like headlines about airstrikes and escalation, but not always like the moments behind those headlines, you know?
And one more thing about coverage, news coverage overall, whether it is international or national, it's never really reflective. The media often has a narrative that it goes by, whether it is internationally or
Absolutely.
nationally. So that's not always very reflective of realities. And like Hasan said, things are often covered in a political light rather than in a social light. So we see numbers, like people dying is just a number. This much casualties, this much deaths, this much villages and buildings decimated. However, we don't see the psychological toll that takes on people that cannot be covered in the news. So that's what they fail to kind of convey for the international community.
That's a really good point, and it kind of goes into the idea of what we have sort of prepared next, so the idea that news coverage doesn't necessarily always, they have their own narratives and it doesn't always match the realities, because we also see international involvement in these conflicts from other major countries like the United States. And in early April, there was a US-Israeli ceasefire deal that was signed and made international news. And even though there has often historically been ceasefires aren't always respected, regardless, this was something that was kind of broadcast as maybe as a stopping point. But then only hours later, Israel stated that the ceasefire did not apply to Lebanon and committed some devastating bombings right after this agreement. How did this kind of recent escalation change your sense of safety or stability in your daily life? And how is that not necessarily reflected maybe in the coverage that was made after?
Yeah.
Um,
For me, oh, do you want to go? Go ahead.
no, go first.
For me, like I wouldn't use change as the word. It just reinforces this same state we're living in. So the ceasefire not being applied, that was very predictable for me, for my family, most people. That was the public discussion at the time. We're used to ceasefires. Like you said, it's often not like not like stuck to. So people don't like, or parties, countries don't really stick to the ceasefire if it's not within their interest. So for us, we knew it wasn't within the Israeli interest to stop the war in Lebanon. So obviously the attacks were very surprising. However, the concept of, oh, a ceasefire was breached, that's not very new to us, whether it's this year, last year, previously, or so on. We know what we're dealing with at this point. It doesn't really surprise us, but it is this social aspect that does. So seeing so many people die in such a short time, that's where our reaction comes into play, not really on the political aspect of things. We have, I feel like Lebanese people have reached an most people have reached a point of acceptance of how politics play out. We know international law is not always fully enforced. We know ceasefires aren't always like fully applied. However, when things happen that affect you socially, people you know, or whether like your people die, that's when you react the most.
Yeah, and to me, I think one of the hardest psychological impacts was losing the feeling that any place was truly safe anymore. So yes, as Stephany said, of course, the ceasefire was like not abiding by the ceasefire was predictable. However, what was not predictable is that they will still start targeting like civilian areas and places where families were trying to escape the danger. And at some point, my family and I were displaced, and we were in those locations. So those like areas were targeted. Like one day before the live face-to-face talks between Lebanon and Israel, which was like very concerning. And I still remember the shock of the moment and how people were like screaming on the roads and on the streets. And it changed the way you think completely. Like when the places people run to for safety no longer feel safe, like your sense of stability, it literally starts to collapse psychologically. And after that, daily life becomes very different because simple things like going to university or sleeping or even leaving home to go get anything like ordinary, it starts feeling very draining and fearful because what if something happens here too? So I think that many people outside Lebanon underestimate how exhausting it is to live that level of uncertainty for a very long period of time.
I think it's so important to try to feel safe in the place that you are, or at least to like be aware of possible changes of the places that you are based on the danger of not. And I think there's other states that do represent some actors that we kind of guide ourselves by sometimes, and also when it comes to policies. So how do you see the United Nations and or other organizations, or for example even like actors states, United States involvement in this type of situations?
Stephany, would you like to go?
Yeah, I can go for this one. Um, the United, like to start off with the United Nations, I feel like there is, like from a politics perspective, there's a huge misconception about the United Nations being this world government that is going to hold everyone accountable and it's going to be able to enforce international law. However, in like politics, when you study, the role of the United Nations is to mitigate conflict, to try to reduce it as much as possible. However, it doesn't have the ability. The United Nations doesn't have an army that can go in and stop wars. The best it can do is just push for negotiations. Um, Despite that, a lot of people aren't aware of that. The average person does not. We're like socially, we know that the UN is supposed to be this peacekeeping organization that's supposed to keep the peace and enforce international law. So there is definitely this disappointment in the UN. There's this helplessness, like where is the UN? What are they doing? What's their role? It's obsolete. It's this is valid because in times of conflict we do want any kind of hope, any kind of actor that can save us out of what we're living through. Regardless of that, I still feel like there is a positive outlook on the UN. They help a lot on the social, even like during times like of peace. Like they still do a lot of social projects here that help a lot of people. And right now they're also distributing, like they're helping a lot as much as they can. So the people are like a lot of people are aware, but there is this sense of like, what are you doing exactly? When it comes to the United States and other international actors, in Lebanon, there's a huge divide over international actors, and there's a side that's like wants US intervention, and then other sides that would rather Iranian intervention. Um, like one side being like anti-West, and then the other side being anti like hegemony overall. So this causes a lot of divide, but a huge like a huge segment of Lebanese society, including myself, are for Lebanese independence completely. We do want to be able to build our country on our own without having anyone intervene, because we live here. We have the right to establish the system we want to live in. We have the right to we have the right to reach consensus on how we want to live in this country. Is that doable? I don't think it is. It's very idealistic. We will end up eventually having some actor win and dominate and like enforce their system. However, it is a dream of ours, and I think of most Lebanese youth, to have our own system someday and to be the ones acting without any external intervention of any sort.
Yeah. I think what Stephany mentioned is really important, and I really see myself in what she said. And I also think that Lebanon has always been in a very sensitive and strategic position in the region. Because of that, many Lebanese people feel that the country often becomes a space where larger international and regional powers confront each other, whether directly or indirectly. And from my perspective, it can sometimes feel like powerful countries become involved when it serves their political or strategic interests. Personally, I think that many people in Lebanon, as Stephany said, would rather go into this Lebanese autonomous state. However, it's very idealistic because at the end of the day, for ordinary Lebanese people, including myself and Stephany, the biggest concern is not geopolitical competition. It's rather simply being able to live safely and with dignity in our own country, you know?
Yes. Thank you so much for those responses. That makes a lot of sense. And I think it was really good for us to get in kind of the overarching perspective of the major groups involved and the institutions involved and the differing perspectives on institutional involvement and international involvement. But something that was kind of touched upon earlier was how in times of conflict, there are aspects that are overlooked, including education within a conflict zone and the right to receiving an education, despite all of this happening around you. What would you say have been some of the biggest challenges that you personally have faced in continuing your rights to an education? How has your universities or schools adapted overall, as you said, because this has been an ongoing thing on and off, but also within the
Yeah.
last several months as there's been escalations?
Yeah.
Yeah, so at the most part, you want to go, Stephany?
No, you go.
Okay, so at the most part, education become online or hybrid, as Stephany also mentioned earlier, during parts of the escalation. But even that was not easy, honestly, because, for example, talking from my case, I was displaced and I lived in a hotel for like 2 months during the war. So trying to continue university while constantly checking my phone to see whether bombings were like close to my area or, God forbid, affecting my house, that was very challenging. And at the same time, I had to also like find a job. So I started working at the Ministry of Health because I needed to help financially support where we were staying after displacement. So because we were staying at a hotel. So there were moments where work schedules, online classes, assignments, like everything else overlapping at once. So like physically, if I was to attend the class, I would be there physically, but like not fully mentally there because of all those other everything that is happening all at once. So honestly, after some time, I stopped caring about my grades. That's with full honesty, the same way I used to, because I have always been a high achieving student academically with a GPA of 4. However, during that period, I started to prioritize protecting my mental well-being and inner peace because it mattered much more than constantly pressuring myself to maintain perfection while living through war. So that was like the biggest challenge.
I won't add much, but I do think during like life or death situations and war and conflict, the list of priorities on the list of priorities, life and survival becomes way higher than education. So this is exhibited in Hasan's behavior. Naturally, you're naturally inclined to like abandon your education if it comes to your safety. So the top
Because you're
priority
in
is
the
safety.
fight or flight mode. So
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. So that's not only applied on the individual level, but also on the institutional level. So for us, public schools were like the Minister of Education. She turned all public schools into shelters. So public schools, to begin with, stopped education. Private schools also were teaching if they were not in affected areas. However, you still have this disruption from what was going on. For us universities, my university switched to hybrid mode. There was also mental health support being provided. Like my university is one of the biggest in the country, so they do have that network to be able to support the students, whether it is by offering shelter or by offering mental health assistance. There was also hybrid learning with optional attendance. So they were doing their best to kind of provide a comfortable environment rather than stressing students additionally with what's going on. However, like that doesn't really do anything. At the end of the day, you're being deprived of your right not from the institutions or from the area you're in, it's by the conflicts. Conflict naturally will cause you to deprioritize education and to place it on a lower pedestal than it usually is on a normal basis. So
100%.
I see you're very aware of everything around you and you do understand the situation that's happening very good, and you do understand the impact that the conflicts and the actors and even the context per se has in the moment at the moment. So I was wondering, have you been how or what have been the responses of your fellow students or friends compared to yours? How do you see that other peers of yours are reacting to this kind of context? And if you see that maybe also them being more conscious about external factors would help them navigate through this whole process.
I'd say that Stephanie's and the answer that we gave, like to the previous question, very much relates to what we're gonna say here. Because I would definitely say that not everyone in Lebanon experienced the conflict the same way. Some students completely lost their homes and are still displaced until today. Others were living in areas that were not directly targeted, and so their daily lives were like less affected or less disrupted, physically and even like some emotionally. However, of course, they're gonna be impacted by everything psychologically. And then, of course, there are some students who experience displacement and instability and constant stress, but we're still trying to continue university and work at the same times. Now, regardless of the differences in experiences, I think that almost every student in Lebanon was affected in one way or another. Like even if you were not directly under bombardment, you are still living in a country filled with fear, uncertainty, and kind of emotional exhaustion. So it differs from one person to the other, but of course, each one of us had like a different kind of experience that was that they were living during the war.
yeah. And I think also during this time, like seeing fellows, like not in the aspect of education, just in like daily conduct, during this time of stress, like Hasan said, it's a very stressful time for everyone, no matter how differently you are affected by the conflict. So we've had this effect of like pointing fingers, like it's this person's fault, it's that person's fault. So there has been also a deepening of divide. We've had increasing tensions within the country. Parties that have already had issues before, they've resurfaced those issues due to the war. And we've had these ongoing tensions between different sects, between different groups. We have this ongoing debate about like disarmament, like disarmament, peace talks with Israel, no peace talks with Israel, so on. And this has turned a lot of people against each other. There is this, like, if I compare the current environment to last year, there's definitely a tightness in the air. There's always this like tension about what to discuss and when to discuss it, specifically in politics. And a lot of peers have reacted with very extreme, like extreme ideas. So some people be like, let's get rid of that group, let's get rid of that group, and so on. So it hasn't been very easy also in the social aspect, in this aspect of division specifically.
Thank you. Kind of going back into that broader perspective of the idea of bodies like the United Nations or other major institutions that are known for more humanitarian efforts or enforcers of international law, there is this idea of international humanitarian law is meant to protect a right to an education, even though this is something that is often unenforced, even in terms of maybe what the broader perspective thought is of these international bodies. Has there been any efforts made to preserve education during these conflicts from these bigger institutions, or is this something that's kind of shifted in priorities as well?
I think it has significantly shifted. Obviously, like I said before, during this like situation of conflict, education's priority goes down. However, currently, like the Ministry of Education and even schools have made this effort. So now that tensions have gone down and like most people have been able to go back to education, there have been efforts to kind of like not let the year go to waste or the time that went to waste. Like there's still some efforts. I won't go into details to explain, but the efforts are very minimal due to how many things or how many other things need to be addressed. Like we're talking about half of the country being decimated, so many people being displaced from the south and like being pushed up into the north. So that's also caused a lot of extra issues as well. We're still within economic collapse. We're still within. So education right now is kind of sidelined. It's still being actively addressed, however, not at the scale that it should be, ideally.
Yeah. And I'd say that access to education became heavily linked to geography and circumstances. For example, like if you were living in southern Lebanon or any other heavily targeted areas like parts of Beirut's southern suburbs, your education was much more disrupted. So from what I personally saw, there was no strong international effort that people on the ground really felt when it came to protecting education during the escalation. A lot of students were like left to trying to manage on their own for months. However, even online education was not always realistic. Many displaced families struggled with internet access. Some were staying at schools and other shelters with no access to internet or electricity or even transportation, which of course has increased the psychological exhaustion of displacement itself. So technically, I'd say that education continued for some people, but for so many others, survival was the priority. So yeah.
I guess my connection was interrupted for a second, so sorry for the delay. I was thinking about bringing education in the topic here because I think it's a very interesting and important aspect, which is often giving us hope. So, how do you stay motivated in pursuing an education during this period, and how does this balance out with prioritizing you and your family's safety?
Yeah, I think that this was briefly mentioned earlier. For example, what keeps me motivated, honestly, is the belief that education can create better opportunities for a more stable future, like for me and my family. So that's how I would relate it to my family. For example, I remember that only a few weeks before the war escalated, I was in Geneva meeting people like leaders from all parts of the world, including Stephany and Patricia. So suddenly everything changed very quickly. I found myself like displaced, exhausted, and concerned about my safety. So when I go back to that part, I feel like it was something like an opportunity that I was privileged to have due to my education and due to other things. So education overall keeps this hope alive that one day I'm going to build a more stable future, like for me and my family.
Very similar to what Hasan said. Education is our last resort. Like we live in a place, it's very much similar to a state of nature. You have to do things on your own. You have to take up matters in your own arms. We like education. This is like reinforced the importance of education. Like in every Lebanese household, I don't think I've ever encountered any person that comes from a household where education has not been prioritized, whether it is recently or when we talked previously. Because during times of conflict, when you keep pursuing your education, you're still like you still have hope. You're still able to potentially travel. Like we have a huge diaspora across the world, and due to their ability to like due to their remaining educated, they've been able to become some of the biggest entrepreneurs. They've started so many businesses. Like I'm sure I know in Romania there's a lot of Lebanese like businessmen and women, and there's so this is a common theme for Lebanese people. Prioritizing education, it's become embedded in our culture that you always educate yourself. If you don't find job opportunities here, which is a problem we struggle with overall, you travel abroad, you help your family, support your family here, you support your country, you come back for the summer, you spend money here to nourish the economy, and so on. For me, I remain motivated to study because I hope to someday contribute to my country in some sense. So I'm currently pursuing politics and I aspire to become a potential diplomat in the future. So I hope that maybe throughout like working as a diplomat, I can potentially like inch us closer to some sense of peace, maybe to some like I would engage in negotiations. I hope to someday help like contribute to my country in some sense. So this is mainly what keeps me motivated. I want to make a change for us because I want my kids to grow up in a better place than I am growing in, and my grandkids to have a Lebanon that I could only dream of. So yeah.
Very nice.
Thank you so much for going into that. And part of the reason that we wanted to have this kind of interview is because we don't often hear about the voices of those who are affected within the conflict zones, and going into the idea of how you're going into your day-to-day life in the present and ideas for the future is really important. But we also wanted to touch on maybe some of the more individual personal impacts. With your level of comfort in answering, what would you say has been the most difficult moment for you personally during this time?
Yeah. For me, I think the April 9 bombings, so the day after the Iran-Israel ceasefire, just seeing, I remember I was with my friend in my university cafeteria and we were just sitting and the notifications start coming in and it's bombings in different places. It was extremely overwhelming. I was just like, what is happening? And then we find out that over 100 missiles were dropped in less than 10 minutes, and so many innocent people died, like over 200, I think over 300 as well. Like people just died, and so many of them are just innocent people, women and children that have no relation to anything that's going on. So seeing all of this was like it made it feel way more real. It made me realize the value of life. Like you start valuing your position that you're in. All of your worries kind of go away and you're just thankful. You're like, I'm thankful I'm at least safe and I'm able to live to see the next day because so many people don't have that. And this was one of many instances, but this is the most recent one I could think of. Stuff like this really shapes you even if you're not affected by it. This is your people. They share your culture, they share your language, they share your lifestyle. So seeing a person that's dying, like I could have been in their position, it changes you a lot and it makes you realize that like we take life for granted very much. So
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, honestly, like every moment was difficult in its own way, but I think the hardest was the very first night of the heavy escalation. It's because I live in the area that was heavily targeted. The bombings were falling around us continuously. And when I say continuously, I really mean it. For several minutes straight, you would hear like explosions everywhere, every few seconds. It did not feel real at first, like the sound, the panic, the confusion, people were shouting. It was like something I still remember very clearly, but it was like traumatic. And we had to rush, quickly put whatever like we could into bags and leave without really knowing where we would supposedly go or whether anywhere was actually safe. Another moment I will never forget was when my mother called me crying, and I already told the story. And when she told me the news that we lost our car. So those moments were of course difficult, and it lets you like remember the feeling of helplessness that you had. So yeah, it made me realize very quickly how fragile normal life really is.
And this being a personal experience and it's something that it's visible for you guys. I think it's also a big difference when it comes to people outside Lebanon. How do you think this situation is seen for the other ones who are outside and are not being able to witness everything you see, and like also the emotional pressure of the situation?
I would like to share
Uh,
like a personal to I'm gonna make it short. I just want to like share a personal experience that I had that I think will bring like brought things into perspective for me, and I think will for you. So at some point I was doing exchange. I was living abroad for about a year, and an earthquake had happened here. I also didn't mention earthquakes. That's part of our resilience as well. We've had multiple earthquakes. So an earthquake happened, and that was the first one. I've never lived through an earthquake. So I open my phone and I see earthquake hits Lebanon, and I see videos of houses in Beirut shaking. So here I immediately call my mom. There was a time difference. I call my mom. I'm like, what's happening? What happened? Like, what's going on? She was like, oh no, it's okay. Like, it's just the house shook a little bit. It's not like an earthquake and like buildings collapse. But on the phone, over the news, things get amplified. Even if the headline isn't so misleading, the reading something instead of witnessing it, it makes it feel so much worse. So this has helped me realize how expatriates or people who live abroad that are Lebanese feel. So when you read the headlines, you immediately think of the worst case scenario, or you misanalyze what could have happened. It's always over dramatized in your head. So them seeing the headlines of what's going on, they're always very stressed. I have relatives all over the world. We're constantly getting like messages and calls, and even some of my friends always reach out. Things feel like things are bad. The situation is bad. However, you feel so worried for your loved ones because you're reading through headlines. You're not actively experiencing what's going on. And it makes it very stressful, especially because they can't come here. They can't, a lot of people are divided from their families. You worry very much, and it's a very difficult situation to be in. It's very scary.
Yeah. And I would like to add to what Stephany said, is that sometimes it's the total opposite. Like sometimes the headlines are like so so peaceful instead of really living the experience. And I think that if I want to like think of youth outside of Lebanon and how they're gonna like understand the situation, I think it really depends, because people like from countries that have also experienced war or instability, for example, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, I think they kind of can often understand us more because they went through those emotions deeply, and many of them like lived similar experiences. In general, I don't think that the emotional toll on young people is always fully understood internationally, because people like see images of destructions or headlines about conflict, but they do not always like see the long-term psychological impact of constantly living with fear, displacement, and instability. So for many young people in Lebanon, the exhaustion is cumulative. It is not only like one event, and we have already mentioned that. It is like years of economic collapse, political instability, insecurity, earthquakes, whatever, like everything that you could ask for is available here. So after some time, it affects the way you think and the way you plan for your future and even experience daily life emotionally. So yeah.
And definitely the impact on daily life can be very nuanced, as has been mentioned a few times. And it was touched upon a bit earlier about how there are generational differences in maybe the perspectives of this day-to-day life, or even the long-term impacts, even just from you to your parents. How would you say that growing up in Lebanon during these ongoing tensions that you personally knew of, or even maybe stories that your parents had or grandparents had told you, kind of shaped your perspective on the conflict today?
Would you like to go, Stephany?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of how to word it. I think like hearing stories from our parents, like I would say the period I grew up in, it was more stable in the sense of security. Like there wasn't active warfare for most of my childhood. So hearing stories from my parents that, oh, like we used to live through war, we used to hear missiles, we used to live through the Civil War, like you'd pass through military checkpoints. If it's a Muslim military checkpoint and then you're a Christian, you're probably getting kidnapped and killed and vice versa. So hearing that, it felt very surreal. I was like, how do people live through such situations? And then when stuff started happening recently with us, like I really learned that we as humans, we have so much ability to resist. And I like part of me feels like no, we shouldn't like sugarcoat things and be like, oh, we're so resilient, and like we shouldn't discredit the brutality of what we're going through. However, I do think it's very inspiring to me how our people consistently find a way to always find new hope, like always pursue, like we talked about this, pursuing an education is always a priority, no matter what, no matter how much conflict affects us. If it's possible, it's being done. And like I see this trend across generations. We always find a way to continue. It doesn't ever stop us. We never just crumble and sit there and don't do anything. Life moves on and we move with it instead of just staying in one place. So for me, it's probably going to be the same. And for my kids, I hope it'll be better. However, I do think it's going to be the same if something similar happens during their generation. That's what I've learned from all these things.
Yeah. As much as I relate to what Stephany has said, I also would like to add something. That personally, growing up through, of course, all these tensions, it pushed me like towards one main belief, to stop taking sides except the side of humanity. So like you will never hear me defending foreign involvement in Lebanon, like while ordinary people are the ones suffering the consequences. Because at the end of the day, what most Lebanese people truly want is very simple. It's safety and stability and dignity. So unfortunately, I think that Lebanon's still far from that reality. But like growing up in Lebanon and during those ongoing tensions, this is exactly the perspective that I've built on that conflict.
At the same time, moving forward and thinking about government, for example, how much do young people trust around uh, you have in the government? Like, what's the institutions and political leaders that are the most trusted in Lebanon today?
This one's for you, Stephany.
Yeah, as I've mentioned in the presentation, our entire system is rigged. It was built rigged, so we've always been stuck in this cycle of, I'm gonna like explain this briefly. When you have a like any community that has so many groups and there's a lot of division, we see in many contexts when that is the case, you as a person, you tend to feel inch closer to your identity. You tend to kind of prioritize. So there's no, like, the government isn't really the central sovereign body. So you go to your head of sect or the head of your political party, that's who you depend on. And political parties also leverage this for elections. So they provide services, so in Lebanon, the government is kind of the on top of that still. But when we speak of basic services, for so many people, like 95% of the population, services and the things we need are often achieved through external parties rather than through the government. And within the government, these parties are part of it. However, there's a lot of corruption. There's so many patronage networks, and it's this constant, like they've led us to so many issues that there's no trust in the entire system anymore, no matter what government comes into play, because at the end of the day, it's the system that's wrong. The system reinforces it. There's this culture of corruption. So even if a good politician goes in, they have to be corrupt to remain within the system. So there's this, oh, like no matter what government we get, it's always like, oh, they're going to be the same. It's going to be the same. It's going to be the same. The recent government we got wasn't officially elected. Like it was on paper, but technically it wasn't by the people. They've been doing some good work. I've had the chance of meeting with some ministers, and I've had the chance of being like in areas where they're working. Definitely compared to previous governments, the change is massive. I do have some hope. However, this culture, the system is still enforcing these inequalities. So there's always going to be this mistrust in the government. And I think this is a common theme across many countries. So it's nothing unique to Lebanon. But when we speak of Lebanon, this is the case.
Yeah, and I honestly agree with what Stephany said. I think that many young people in Lebanon have lost a large amount of trust in political institutions over the years, especially after everything that the country has gone through recently. There's this feeling among many youth in Lebanon that we're trying to survive mostly through our personal effort, through family support, especially the diaspora, or some community support from political affiliations and other sources, rather than through stable institutions. But at the same time, I really think that the frustration comes from caring deeply about the country and wanting something better for Lebanon's future, which is what we, of course, hope for.
So, with kind of this feeling of survival or fight or flight, and maybe this loss of trust in larger institutions, do you think students and young people today have meaningful ways to make their voices heard or exist in Lebanon?
Yeah, I think there's this huge misconception when we speak of the Middle East, and I've seen this like with so many people that I talk to abroad. When we say Middle East, there's always this like idea that oh, dictatorships, no freedom of speech. That's true. I don't want to dismiss that because a lot of people tend to dismiss. There is a lot of suppression of freedom of speech in the region. However, when we speak of Lebanon, I do think like despite all the flaws we've had, we do have a very like an open democracy. Like you
Yeah.
can openly express your opinion, you can constantly critique the government, your voice is heard. The problem is not with expressing, it's with actually taking the voices and enforcing them into tangible action. There's no capability, so there's institutional paralysis. There's like institutions overall over the years, due to the patronage networks that I've talked about and due to this like widespread corruption, they've lost their capabilities. So even if voices are heard and then promises are made, when it comes to enforcement, that's where the weakness is. It's not with making voices heard. The government is aware there's so many issues and they don't deny it. They're openly admitting that there's something wrong. However, it's gotten so messy and it's so tangled to the point where action is always paralyzed by some other factor.
Yeah. And I also believe that opportunities do exist, but it could be like still limited in many ways. For example, conversations and webinars like this one are very important because they give people like the chance to speak about their experiences directly instead of having others speak on their behalf. And at the same time, I do see like many young people, including myself in Lebanon, try to make their voices heard through volunteering, for example, or activism, university initiatives, social media. So I personally see many youth becoming more socially and politically aware over the past years. But honestly, there is still a feeling among many young people that their voices are not always translated into real influence. Whereas, like, of course, we could have seen a heavenly Lebanon if that would have been the case. But we still haven't seen like change at the institutional level.
Thank you very much. And I think when it comes to the international involvement, what kind of international involvement, in your opinion, or whether from the US or other countries, do young people from Lebanon believe that it could be really valuable at this moment?
I think right now Lebanon is this is a very difficult question because as I've mentioned before, there are a lot of divisions. And particularly right now, so many people are divided. There's different stances on this specifically. I think in terms of regional interventions, we've had prior experiences that have made many Lebanese people very skeptical about our neighbors' interventions, like Arab neighbors. And in the sense of the United States as well, US foreign policy has also been very controversial in the region for many people. So that's also highly rejected. When it comes to the EU overall, I don't believe I've ever heard, and I don't think the public opinion has anything against it. However, for it to be effective, it would have to be not with a top-down approach. It would have to be more collaborative. And we've seen that. I've seen that with many projects with the EU. Like at my university, there's a couple of collaborations with the EU on many programs. So it has taken a social face to it, which I think has been very effective and has been very constructive. And I think the general public will be more accepting of that rather than it being very imposed, taking the form of imposition.
Yeah. I do agree with what Stephany has said, but I'm gonna personally like step aside from political talks because I don't think that Lebanese people are looking for more political tension or external conflict on Lebanese land. We don't want external influence in politics on Lebanon. So I think that most probably we would like support for all sectors such as education, healthcare, especially financial support, because this is what we really need. Many families and students have been under enormous economic pressure, especially with displacement. So, and due to, of course, the collapsing of the economy. So I think that we should much rather focus on the financial support than political influence. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say. Like, if I think external influence would be accepted if it doesn't take the form of direct political intervention.
Definitely,
If
yeah.
it takes the form of social assistance, I feel like no matter who intervenes will be welcomed with open arms. But again, that's not really the reality most times. So I don't know how much like the foreign intervention would be very welcomed. And maybe sometimes a
Yeah.
specific side will welcome a specific country and then another one won't. So it might cause divide more than actually helping the country overall. So it's a very fragile context right now. So a full answer to this could not be given, I believe.
I agree.
Okay, so we're kind of wrapping into the question portion and we're going to switch over to the Chatham House rules. But before we do that, and we're going to open up the floor in that way. But before we do that, is there anything about your experience that you haven't gotten into that you feel is overlooked or misunderstood that you would want to share with a broader audience before leading into that portion?
I'd say that probably one thing that is usually overlooked is the long-term impact of such events. So let's say, of course, because we've been through multiple wars, buildings could be rebuilt, infrastructure could be back. People's way of living and people's experiences, this is gonna last for long, and this is gonna shape how they live every day. So I noticed that many young people around me stopped thinking too far ahead during the escalation. Like, for example, conversations became less about dreams and long terms and more about like safety and displacement. So I think people outside Lebanon sometimes forget that behind every headline, there are ordinary people trying to continue their lives somehow. So for example, let's say students who are trying to study or parents who are trying to protect their family. And honestly, I do not think human beings are supposed to get used to that sound of bombings. But after some time, unfortunately, we are. So I think that this is kind of overlooked, and it is the long-term impact of such events. And I don't want to like go into practical scientific terms such as post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm just like trying to stay broad on how this experience is gonna last with us for long, especially with children who grew up during this war.
And I think something I often reflect on personally is how normalized it's become for us. Like when I discuss
Mhm.
things with my foreign friends and I'll talk about, oh, we hear warplanes, or sometimes we see bombings or we hear bombings. It sounds insane to someone that, oh, this is actually a war experience. For me, because I like the area where I live isn't directly affected by the bombings. The most I'll see is like from my window, I might see some bombings or I could hear warplanes or drones sometimes. So it doesn't feel real for me. However, it like this is not normal. For me, it feels like, oh, I'm living a normal life compared to others in my country. However, to a person who's living abroad, that's not a normal experience. So the normalization of war and it's also there's another topic we could go into about how it's romanticized and how it's become very regulated, especially in the context of the Middle East, that, oh, this is this region, it's always going to be at war. It's always going to be in conflict. There's always going to be problems. We're a complex region. However, that's not a normal thing. Warfare is not normal by human nature, and especially not for Middle Eastern people. We want to live in peace. However, we're torn by specific conditions, and we've learned to live with it, but that's not something to be normalized, and it's not okay at all. So,
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much for sharing these and going through our panel of questions today. We really appreciate the time and just how involved that you've gotten in each and every one. We're going to be shifting up the format of the discussion a little bit now to the rules that we spoke about earlier. So I'll pass it over.